Hawkgirl issue 1, Jediah Axelrod, writing with
Yep.
Amanke and Yuhilpin on the art. So this is our new Hawkgirl miniseries, 6 issues. And first thing I'll say about this is that this feels like it's fairly well thought out in the sense that it spends time building his villain. It teases the villain before we get to Kendra, and then it feels like it's got something to say about Kendra. The whole issue kind of deals with her basically lying about feeling okay, and there's those panels that they keep throwing in every so often of her like on the floor in a fetal position.
Yep.
Clearly, she's having a hard time, but she's not willing to let anyone in to actually open up and talk about it.
It's a character that we always associate with another character, right? Like she's always with Hawkman, or she's always with the Justice Society. So her being by herself right now, because they talk about how her and Jean broke up early on.
I think the reason why I'm really focusing on that to start with is that I feel like I've read a lot of minis, or even just a lot of issue 1s of minis in the last couple of years, where it feels like if you've got a miniseries, it feels like you should have a story that you're there to tell over your 6 issues. And so many of them kind of feel like they're just like, nah, they're just 6 issues of like, because we want to write this character. There's not actually
necessarily... It's just like an arc.
Yeah.
And, you could drop it in. This feels like an actual story with the way that it opens up with, the story of the fox. Once upon a time, there was a fox, and it keeps going back to that. And then, it does its different versions when it gets to Kendra, when it gets to... What's her name? Galaxy?
Yeah, Galaxy's the other...
She's from one of the YA graphic novels.
From Axelrod's own.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
But it feels like it's got a mission statement and it's got a purpose. And, it spends time building up its villain. So I do think it's a little bit wordy. Like all the stuff about the Fox on that first page.
That first page and went, oh, man. But...
yeah, that's my promise. I agree with all the things you've said, but I did not like reading it at all. Like I thought, like it was very wordy, and I didn't think it flowed that well. And I didn't really like a lot of the. I feel like the dialogue felt.
Yeah, my bigger problem came from the dialogue. Was the stuff from Kendra mostly, because I get they're trying to write Kendra as someone that's like putting up a front and like I'm fine, I'm telling it fine, and sometimes that's a tough thing to hit in print. But I know she just didn't sound like Kendra that I've read before.
No, I didn't think that Power Girl sounded particularly great either. Like most of the characters, I thought just didn't sound right, and because they kind of compounded, because it wasn't just one character, it was a lot of them, and then it just made it like a bit of a chore to read. Even though I like what it is, I like the core ideas, and I like this is a statement, this is what the book is, this is the plans. I like all those things. I just don't like reading it, which is kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it basically comes down to not liking the writer's voice, I suppose.
Yeah. That didn't bother me as much, because I was once I started to see where this was going with the nth metal and the mystery of what the villain's doing with it has got me. I can excuse some of the other stuff.
Oh, we have to actually talk about what some of that is. So the villain made this like pact. It's always like a deal with the devil style thing, where the villain showed up to this little girl and said, "You can have anything you want," and she's a little girl, so she asked for a pony. But it's basically you have to wear this necklace, and then you have to give me what I want someday when I come looking for it. And this is in present day she's coming to collect, and it turns out this necklace was made of nth metal. And it was basically the idea that if this girl wore it her whole life, she would have this unique properties because she's sort of soaked in this nth metal. I'll call it radiation for lack of a better term. And basically is going to try and mess with nth metal to try and get home. By the sounds of it, this villain wants to go back somewhere using nth metal to create a portal. So, it sounds like, it sets her up. It sets up that she's villainous. And meanwhile, Kendra is having some issues with her nth metal, and ends up, sort of this galaxy ends up helping her in a fight, and she asks Batman for like, "Hey, do you have intel on this character?" Which is an amusing enough little page, because Batman's like, "Nah, not much," and then he proceeds to talk for like 5 bubbles about all the information he has on her, and she's like, "Wait, that's not much. How much do you have on me?" So that was amusing enough. So no, I like that it feels like it's trying to deal with this idea of like really saying that Kendra has some emotional problems and she's not talking about it, and we're going to take this book to explore that. And I think I appreciate that because so many miniseries for, B-list and C-list characters tend to just kind of, like, I'm not saying this is up to the standard of like a Tom King mini where he takes a character and like super elevates them.
Right,
But I do think this is a step above what a lot of like typical miniseries do with these types of characters.
it's a difference in something like this and then the Blue Beetle, right? The Blue Beetle mini that came out. It was supposed to read. Just felt like the next arc of whatever Blue Beetle.
It feels like it's going through the motions, basically.
Yeah.
This at least feels like it's doing something. I will say obviously there's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot of queer characters in this book. There's a lot of discussion of political topics. At one point, there's like a sort of flashback where it shows Kendra in college at a Black Lives Matter protest, and I felt weird about that just because it's the same way that in the last week Mark Waid had like Teen Titans like when they were kids,
Drones,
and they've got smartphones and they're using social media, and I'm like, wait, how far forward is the timeline slid?
I think you got to remember though, Kendra's not that old already.
That's fair, but
coming out of college will only be a few years ago potentially.
I mean, you say that, but it doesn't feel like it's only a few years ago.
Kendra is pretty young though, so if you told me that it was like within 5 to 10 years since she's left college.
Yeah. Well, 10 years would be too early, though.
That would be.
For this particular reference. So it kind of paints it into this very specific window when, like, that's not even far back enough to go to the start of the New 52, which I don't know how much the timeline has slid since then. I guess it has a bit. But...
Right.
It's just one of those weird things where we're tying in a real world event.
Maybe they're just slightly future proofing this to for the next few years.
Maybe, yeah. It's just
especially as it's a mini, so it's probably just going to be sold on its own
Yeah.
It's just one of these weird things that's happened a few times recently where they're backdating and saying, hey, this early part of this person's superhero career happened when smartphones already existed, or happened when Black Lives Matter was already a phrase. And it's just kind of this weird thing where I'm like, oh, wow, it feels like we're really moving the goalposts here, which happens gradually throughout comics. This just feels like the most like noticeable sudden jump that I've felt probably since I started reading them. But,
Yeah, I don't know if it's more just the fact that it is still a relatively recent thing that we're noticing it more, or if it is just a case of maybe you just they're using more drastic and obvious things to date it now.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, it's not a big deal. It's just something that stuck out to me because it reminded me of how I felt with those smartphones in World's Finest last week. But yeah, so anywho, so again, she's lying to her friend about how she feels. She's lying to the Justice League about how she feels. She wants to find out more about this Galaxy character, who we see lives in her fancy penthouse
in Metropolis. Yeah. In like there's a section of Metropolis that where the aliens live. I think they're calling A-Town. Which was that something from Supergirl? I feel
it sounds familiar. I don't think it's the first time it's come up.
But yeah, so so we're blending that type of stuff, and
Kendra ends up falling through her skylight when her end metal starts acting up later in the issue. So
so there's some stuff with the nth metal I like that Axelrod's doing where one of Galaxy's powers is that they can see like spectrums of energy and stuff, and when they look at
and manipulate as well, I think, not just
manipulate it. That's right. When they look at the nth metal on Kendra, they see that it's almost like a solid form of energy, like it's living, but it's in a solid state, which is something I think that's not new to nth metal, but I do like that's where they're going with the whole villain, where it absorbs their energy. So like if 50 years on a regular person, that was the amount of energy that the villain could pull from that one person in the beginning. What's going to happen when they try to pull from Kendra, who's always been associated with the nth metal through however many different timelines, right? So, I kind of like that with the whole idea of the solid energy and all of this. So I'm curious to see where this goes and ends up. And but I enjoyed reading it for the most part. It was a little wordy, but I did like the art too. I mean, I like the
The
artist.
Hulkman's always pretty good.
The Hulkman, that's
Yeah.
pretty solid.
I appreciate that it sort of sets up its own supporting cast and that it does have this kind of, okay, we're establishing this villain's got a goal and it's separate from Kendra, but obviously the nth metal connection is going to bring them together. That feels like really developed to me, and that it feels like it feels like a big deal when they do cross paths, which is good. You know, it's hard to do that with a new villain in your first issue of a comic. And then on top of that, you know, the fact that we're dealing with Kendra not being honest about how she feels about things and what she's going through, it's like, okay, there's an arc here to have. I think from a raw storytelling perspective, it's doing a lot of smart things. And the only real issue that I had with it really was just some of the wordiness of it. You know, a few, you know, condense it down to some less words is all really I would say. But yeah, I was pretty much into it as well. So, yeah. All right, were you rating it, Matt?
I'll give it a 7.5.
Connor?
I'm gonna give it a 5. I like the ideas, don't like the writing style, like the voice. So it was hard for me to enjoy. But it's not bad.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Matt. 7.5. Like, there's obviously improvements to be made, but I think all the things it's doing right gets it a pretty reasonable score.